I'd like to take a few minutes to look at the layout I'm providing for the chapter on exterior daylighting. Layout and lighting are inextricably linked. You must have a good layout in order to achieve a good lighting solution. What I've done in this case is to optimize this outdoor scene for the camera's point of view. Let's load that camera into an unused viewport. I'll go for this front view here. Click on front and choose cameras, Phys Camera 001. And then press the F3 key to show shading in that viewport. And show safe frames as well with Shift F. And that'll crop to the current render aspect ratio. Additionally, let's select the camera in the top view. And now we see the blue lines indicating the camera's field of view or its frustum. It shows us exactly what is in the camera's field of view and what is not. And if we back out in this top view with the mouse wheel, we can see that I've got a couple pieces of geometry, a near or close piece of ground and a far piece of terrain. And they're both being displaced. Let's tumble around here in the perspective view and press F4 in that perspective view to show the wireframe on shaded or edged faces. And let's select that large terrain. Get in close on that with the mouse wheel. And now go into the Modify panel. I want to show you something really interesting here. I've got a plane, and a plane primitive in 3ds Max allows us to bump up the resolution at render time. Select plane at the bottom of the modifier list. And down here we have render multipliers. We've got an object that is 2.5 kilometers in length. And right now it's only got 50 segments along that length. But we can multiply the density or the level of detail at render time and capture all the wonderful detail inherent in the displacement map that I've applied here. Let's increase the density up to a factor of 10. We don't see any change in the viewport, but with that perspective view selected, let's click on Render Production, and that renders to the frame buffer using Mental Ray with Final Gathering. And we can see that there is a lot of detail there now. That's a useful technique to manage your polygon counts for a terrain. We can see down here that the terrain currently will only take up 180,000 triangles or faces in the final rendering. But if we continue to increase this value, the number of faces will go up. I could set it to maybe 30. And now I've got 1.6 million triangles. And that's more like a production value. A good rule of thumb for polygon count in 3ds Max is try not to go over 10 million polygons in your scene. You may start to have some serious performance issues when you do. So I can set this distant plane, terrain far, to have a density of 30, which will give me 1.6 million triangles. I could also select the ground in the foreground. We can take a look at that here. Go into its modifier panel, select the plane primitive, and increase the number of polygons once again, or level of detail. Let's give it a value of 5, and that takes us up to 2.2 million polygons. We could possibly go up higher, but for the purposes of this scene, it'll probably be enough. And open up the Layer Explorer on the main toolbar. I'm a big fan of organizing things onto layers. Here's one labeled 1 Space Warps, and it's currently hidden. I'll make it visible by clicking on the eye icon. And now these 2 squares are visible. Those are space warps, and they're bound to these meshes. Open up the layer, and we can see there is a close space warp. And that is driving the displacement on the near geometry here. And then a far space warp. And that's accounting for the displacement here. And in the case of the far space warp, if we go over to its Modify panel, we can see that there is an incoming bitmap there. Height map Desert Mesas 4096 by 4096.exr. And that's a height map that I generated in the program Vue, VUE, from Eon Software. And I've applied it here to drive the displacement of that geometry in world space. And that means now, within the boundary of this space warp, I can select this planar geometry and move it around or change its size if needed. So just to demonstrate, I'll maximize the perspective view with Alt-W and grab the Move tool and change the position here. And you can see that we can actually move within that displacement and precisely position the geometry so that it will correspond to the area that the camera can see. All right, I'll undo that with Control-Z and place it back at its starting position. There's a lot going on with the material shaders in this scene, and we don't have time to cover all of that, but suffice it to say that I'm also projecting UVs onto this surface using a camera map. If we go back into the Layer Explorer, if we open up the layer labeled 1 Space Warps, there's also a camera. I can make that visible. And this is orthographically projecting UVs onto this planar object so that the height map and the diffuse map rendered out from view will line up. All right, so this is what I've done in order to make sure that we don't have crazy render times. We can optimize the resolution of our terrain so that we will have the polygons more or less concentrated in the camera frustum. In this course on lighting, we don't have time to go into space warps or camera projection maps in detail, but you can look those up in the 3ds Max documentation. It's pretty well documented there. All right, I'm going to turn off the Space Warps display and close the Layer Explorer, go back to my 4 viewport layout with Alt-W. As we look at the scene from an aerial point of view in the perspective panel, we can see that the scene is mostly empty. But we're going to fill all of that void with an environment map so that our reflections in shiny objects such as the dome and the global illumination will give a sense of us actually being embodied in this space. And that's an overview of this workflow, which allows us to optimize render times, setting our level of detail of the terrain objects adaptively, and positioning them in world space so that they only just fill the camera's field of view.